Our mandate here in the lecture series is to introduce you to the world's finest practicing landscape architects, and no A-list of practicing landscape architects internationally would be complete without an introduction to our speaker, Laurie Olin. No stranger to the museum, Laurie has in fact been a trusted advisor and friend of the museum in long standing in a variety of roles. In fact, I have it on good advice that it was Laurie's advice originally in a previous strategic planning exercise that proposed launching a landscape curatorial position in addition to horticulture. And so in some ways, I'm indebted personally as the second holder of this position to Laurie's advice. That was, of course, not the first time that I benefited from Laurie's generosity and sage wisdom. I have it, I think, quite clear in my mind. My first semester in graduate school at the University of Pennsylvania, Laurie Olin was the first landscape architect, as I understood it, to come and sit on reviews of student work and critiqued one of my own design projects. And unlike many of his colleagues, he was quite nice about it. That stuck with me, in addition to being a very, very smart critic. And I think it's true that that was probably my first exposure to what a landscape architect might do in crossing the aisle to talk to architects. And I think that's had a disproportionately large impact on my own thought processes. I think it would also be fair to say that Laurie's work has been quite significant, not only for myself, but a generation of us who really now think of landscape as a medium of urbanization. And Laurie's earlier work clearly led that way. To the extent you know Laurie's work, you may know his work associated with a series of projects beginning in the 1970s and 80s that I associate with a kind of renaissance of American urbanism. You may have experienced Bryant Park in New York, or maybe his work planning around Battery Park City. For me, it was the North Courtyard of the Art Institute that first got my attention. You know, if you have an afternoon in May and you have a couple of hours and you're picking a North American venue, that courtyard for me would be in my top three, I have to say, an extraordinary piece of urbanity. In addition to those projects, Laurie's practice has been engaged over many decades, not only with set-piece, urban, and campus problems, but equally a range of ecologically driven and process-driven designs. And I think in some ways, as I was reflecting in preparation for this evening, I think in some ways that the field is coming back to Laurie in a way, that he was out ahead in the sense of looking at urban set-piece work and thinking of landscape as a medium of urbanization. And at the same moment, we today are often talking about a kind of thickening of process-driven work, but a return to form or a return to spatial order. And in that regard, I think Laurie Olin's work over the past several decades is quite significant. Equally significant is a range of his collaborations. He's collaborated with a range of landscape architects and architects over many years. Among them, for example, his long-standing collaborations with the architect Peter Eisenman are notable here. It speaks to his kind of cosmopolitan view and sociability that he gets on with almost everyone. I haven't met anyone in my professional and personal life that has a bad word to say about Laurie, I can tell you that. I discovered later on that, in fact, Laurie studied architecture, and that helped put some of the pieces to me back together. He did his undergraduate work in architecture at the University of Washington, where he was exposed to the work of Rich Haag and others. He then subsequently moved to New York and was engaged in practice for many years. Following a couple of quite significant fellowships, a Guggenheim and then a Rome Prize Fellowship in the mid-1970s, he was invited to teach at the University of Pennsylvania in the mid-1970s. And it was there that he entered into a practice with Bob Hanna and Hannah Olen that went on to do that work I referred to earlier. In addition to his collaboration with Bob Hanna, he also has, of course, been a partner at the Olen Partnership for the past several decades. He's an extensive writer, an extraordinary draftsperson. He also served a term as chair of the Harvard Graduate School of Design Department of Landscape Architecture. We were just comparing notes about his experience there. I can tell you from my experience at the GSD, among the seminal accomplishments of Laurie's tenure, in addition to being central to bringing Michael van Valkenburg to the school, was the integration of architecture and landscape architecture studios, the promotion of ecology as a way of thinking about design, and ultimately the integration of theory between architects and landscape architects. All of these are things that are still with us today. Laurie has been recognized with virtually every high honor our field has to bestow. In addition to being a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, he is a recipient of the American Academy of Arts and Letters, a recipient of the Cooper-Hewitt National Design Award, and the ASLA Medal. In 2012, President Obama bestowed upon him the National Medal of Arts. Please welcome Laurie Olin.
Well, Good evening, and thank you, Charles. I'd really like you to do the obituary, please. That's great. It's very, very generous and kind of you, and it's nice to be back at the Gardner and back in Boston. Here we go. And now for something different. Okay, there we go. As you just heard, for several decades, my office and practice have considered the relationship between the medium of landscape architecture and the making of civic places. One of my recurring concerns has been that the purpose and attitudes toward real life or civil expression, and as Charles just said, I've been interested in meaning. Now, the central purpose of landscape architecture, as everybody in the room probably knows, is the planning and design of land and its features. And these include the positioning and relationship of diverse elements of earth and water, vegetation, roads, pavement, and structures, including buildings, for private and public purpose. And familiar topics include parks, squares, piazzas, campuses, systems of public space, community infrastructure, reservations for the conservation of natural area and resources. And in doing this work, it's common to consider aspects of natural systems and physical character, the soils, the geology, the hydrology, the climate, the topography, ecology, as well as the cultural artifacts and the historic legacy of a given location, those things that define what has come to be known as the genius loci, to use that familiar phrase. Now, in the course of developing plans and proposals for the development, redevelopment, and transformation of sites from one situation to another, and considering the nature of proposed result, in addition to issues of ecological health and aesthetic merit, broad topics dealt with extensively in most academic institutions that teach landscape architecture, the design of public space raises ethical issues regarding social purpose, use, and behavior that are often inadequately addressed or understood in the discourse of either professional schools or of practice. Civic space has been central to the evolution of urban communities, and like them has taken different forms and has expressed and accommodated different needs and functions through time. While the vast majority of public space in nearly all communities is devoted to movement, to circulation and access, other spaces devoted to public encounter, gathering, recreation, and leisure remain important and among the most cherished and the most contested. We no longer have cattle markets and public executions in the heart of our cities, but we still use them for civic events and public rituals, for sport, for play, socialization, relaxation, celebration, and protest. The majority of parks, squares, boulevards, and civic spaces that we all enjoy as a legacy of 19th century planning and design in New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Chicago, or Philadelphia, as seen here at the beginning and end of that era of the 19th century, they are in large part a direct result of social and economic changes that gave rise to a vast middle class for whom they were intended. With this development also came a democratization of art and literature that extended well into the 20th century, developments that I wish to consider against a background of thought and behavior that accompanied these changes. The question, what is real, has preoccupied people who care to stop and consider it for centuries. Any number of academics, critics, or philosophers today would answer, that depends upon the cultural and relativistic orientation of one's conceptual apparatus. Isaiah Berlin has remarked that realism normally means the correct perception of the characteristics of events or facts or persons without the distortions produced by feelings like hope or fear or love or hate, or by a disposition to idealize or depreciate, or any action founded on it as a result of emotional pressure of some kind. Realism in the arts as an idea or problem appears in the mid-19th century as a contrast and antagonist of romanticism and various forms of historical eclectic revival styles of painting, such as you see here, and of writing of that previous century. Centered in France between 1840 and 1880, the aim of realism, according to Lyndon Olen, was truthful, objective, and impartial representation of the real world based upon the meticulous observation of contemporary life. One must also remember that this took place in the aftermath of a number of transformative revolutions and events beginning with two in England in the 17th century, one that was bloody and one bloodless, and two more, one in America and another in France at the end of the 18th century, both violent and both setting in motion events similar yet quite different and still playing out as social experiments. One can't help but think of Chou En-lai's remark when he was asked about his thoughts about the French Revolution, and his great reply was that he didn't know as it was still too early to tell. These social and political events that focused upon governance, individual liberty, and the universal rights of man took place within the context of the gathering Industrial Revolution, the redistribution of population in Western countries from agricultural settings to urban ones, and the dramatic growth of cities across Europe and America, expanding economies, worldwide colonial exploitation of resources and people, and the emergence of a vast capitalist consumer product enterprise. This painting by Manet presents the mingling of classes, of the hautement and the petite bourgeoisie, those in governance with those who were bohemians and the avant-garde, of grandmothers and authors, who have all been identified in this picture, as a matter of fact, a new dynamic social mix in the Tuileries that you see here, a public park that had been fashioned from a former private royal estate and pleasure garden. So realism in art and design emerged in this era as a deep interest in trying to see and understand what the world is and had become. And it quickly became ideological and controversial, initiating the situation of a self-proclaimed avant-garde. The reaction by Géricault, Courbet, Daumier, and Millet, the writings of Zola, these are two Manet paintings. One is of his friend Zola there on the left, and the other is a version of Nana, a creation of Zola's of sorts. And the writings of Balzac, Flaubert, and others, along with the paintings of Manet, Pissarro, Degas, Monet, Seurat, Renoir, as well as the writings of Baudelaire and the brothers Goncourt, these seem to us today to be the celebration of both the hautement and the bourgeois. The shoppers, the gossips, it's of the flaneurs, the cafe society, workers, the entire world of souls who filled the grand magazines that we today call department stores, the arcades, the boulevards, the cafes, bars, and the parks. They concerned themselves, these writers and painters, equally with the physical and social world of their day. The literature and painting, especially that labeled Impressionism, was a reaction against sentimentality, fantasy, and romanticism. And it attempted to directly and accurately present life in whatever subject matter came to the artist's attention, something also referred to by some as the truth. Among the last paintings of Manet, and these are among my favorites, are these very close, very loose, very bold and powerful observations of flowers brought to him by his friends as he lay dying. It was a portrayal of a palpable, immediate world. One of the things that his generation witnessed and engaged, that as often as not was both the setting and subject, was the new public and civic realm produced by the bureaucracy of the Prefect of the Seine under Haussmann and Alphonse's grand projects of the boulevards and the parks. The transformation of the urban structure and the former royal enclaves, along with the parks and squares that they created from scratch between 1840 and 1860, produced the Paris painted by Monet, as you see here in these two paintings, that we still know today. This series of public works recently served, I think quite recently, served as a model for the grand projet of the later part of the 20th century, undertaken by Pompidou, d'Estaing, Mitterrand, and Chirac. One obvious motive for the creation of Parc La Villette, Parc Citron, Parc Bercy, the Jardin Atlantique, Parc Diderot, and the others was not just simply to enhance the city of Paris for the benefit of its citizens and the nation. Another motive was that such parks were a device to instruct the large influx of immigrants from Africa, the Middle East, and a host of former colonies on how to socialize and behave in public, how to be a French citizen. This was also that period of the 19th century I just referred to. It was also the era of Frederick Law Olmsted and his remarkable and innovative work. Following upon the thought of Emerson, Thoreau, and others, and he was a contemporary of Marx and Engels, of Lincoln and Herzen, Olmsted proposed an urban agenda of reconstruction and infrastructure, bringing aspects of the natural and rural world into the heart of large cities in an attempt to contribute to the betterment and health of the urban poor, as well as the middle class that he represented from which he'd come. At times in the past decade, his work has been characterized by some of my former students and peers as romantic and out of date, pigeonholing and even dismissing his great works as picturesque and old-fashioned. Nevertheless, despite the fact that FLO was framing his views and work in the Victorian era, like that of Manet or Alphonse, there are reasons to take it as profound and prescient, regardless of how it may have aged or looked to young Turks today who have been raised on the internet and dreamy digital imagery. From about 1870 to 1920, critical dispute in literature focused upon the naturalism of Zola, Proust, and others reacted strongly against what they perceived to be the overdetermination of works of art by their content alone, and what was seen as an almost total passivity before the raw phenomena. Painting, especially Impressionism, pursued light, color, and issues of the relationship between perception and representation, leading without planning or intent to the radical departures that we know of as cubism, abstraction, and the abandonment or eventually even an interest in representation. In America, the so-called Ashcan school of Sloan, Henri, Glackens, and others carried the earlier French agenda forward with a heavy dose of social observation and critique. As the Great Depression deepened, artists such as Edward Hopper and Walker Evans shifted the emphasis away from the collective toward the individual and towards solitude, as did writers as different in style as James Joyce, T.S. Eliot, and Robert Frost. Debates about realism continued into the 1930s, but were hijacked and debased by political agendas in America, Europe, and most dramatically, Russia, where a form of radical propaganda virtually drove it from the stage of leading design and art, at least in the realm of civic space, even while social critics such as Lucas, Brecht, Adorno, Benjamin astutely addressed the relationship between forms of production and the results, sociologically and politically, if not satisfactorily aesthetically. The world of what is called fine art wandered off, and over the next 50 years went through a series of self-proclaimed avant-gardes, radical shifts of concept, production, and fashion that, regardless of the brilliance and merit of the work, had little effective engagement with the larger issues of the urban realm, the quality of life in cities, or the perplexities of design, whether it be of parks and landscape, emerging ecological crises, or architecture. This, in part, is due to an obsession with novelty and a fixation of what was only one aspect of early modernism, a desire for transgression, to shock and upset the established order, not necessarily a sound basis for the design of public space, especially if a major purpose is to engender community and health. Now let me try to explain my interest in this topic of realism a bit more. In 1967, the year that I made these sketches, I became disenchanted with the design and the creation of buildings, no matter how interesting, which I'd been doing for some time in several of the best offices on both the West and the East Coasts. It was a time of questioning for every thoughtful person in my generation, whether about society and its behavior, or the world, the civil rights movement, the war in Vietnam, war in the Middle East, the Russian invasion of Central Europe, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and generally a society at war itself between generations. I retreated first to a cabin at the end of Long Island and then to one on an island in Puget Sound in an effort to refocus upon the world and life. I had studied with the poet Theodor Retke for several years during and after architecture school and was deeply impressed by what we read, such as Ezra Pound's one-line manifesto of modernism, "Make it new." Yes, of course. But what it was, we had to figure out. Or Wallace Stevens' quote, "Not the idea about the thing, but the thing itself." Or what we found in William Carlos Williams or Emily Dickinson, Walt Whitman, and others, it all pointed to perception and confrontation with the physical world and its splendor, in its ordinariness and minutiae, as had people like Emerson and Thoreau. Each, in their way, had demanded starting afresh from a confrontation with ordinary things and the fundamentals of human existence and community. So for several years, I drew a lot and everywhere in an attempt to take up the pleasures and burdens of daily life and nature. I went into the woods, as Thoreau said, and yet, like him, I came out again to live and study life on Skid Road in Seattle and to re-enter architecture briefly for 3 more years as my friends, teachers, and I battled City Hall and the business community to save the Pike Place market. Next, I managed to leave America for several years to live, as Charles just said, to work and study and read, to write and think in Europe, mostly in Italy and England, with doses of France and Germany. What I saw and absorbed confirmed my instincts to develop a focus upon the landscape of cities in their civic realm, their parks, their gardens, squares, piazzas, streets, and boulevards. The accumulated framework and infrastructure of the public spaces of cities, grand and small, which provide the setting for social interaction that was so fundamental to the health and welfare of their citizens. Places that played an important role in their daily life, as well as in the spirit, understanding, and imagination of workers, poets, artists, business leaders, politicians. The evolution, form, elements, and management of the civic spaces that I admired fascinated me. Returning to America to teach in a department of landscape architecture that even then was internationally distinguished for its pioneering work in ecological planning and design, almost immediately I became involved in an ambitious transportation and civic design study for Washington, D.C., funded by the NEA. Among the many proposals we made was one for a light rail system with the portion you see here in these sketches of mine on K Street. Interestingly enough, it is now 40 years later, it apparently is finally proceeding. ZGF from Portland are doing it. They have a Washington office now. I was interested to see which of the things I'd observed of European public life could be applied here. I also had come to the conclusion that unless we could make our cities rich and satisfying places to live, and get Americans to see a reason to live more densely, we'd never be able to stop the disastrous sprawl of suburban development. We'd never be able to save the rural and agricultural lands near cities that is so important, nor even the more distant forests and wilderness. I recalled a remarkable essay I'd read in school in 1959, believe it, 1959, that J.B. Jackson wrote and published in his little yet prescient magazine Landscape, entitled The Imitation of Nature, that discusses the impossibility of doing so. And in it, he wrote, quote, "As a man-made environment, every city has three functions to fulfill. It must be a just and efficient social institution. It must be a biologically wholesome habitat, and it must be a continuously satisfying aesthetic sensory experience." Wow. Well, almost immediately upon opening our office, Bob Hanna and I plunged into several significant projects over a brief 5-year span of intense activity, risk, experiment, and optimism. Some might also say naivete. These include the 16th Street Transit Mall in Denver, which you see on the right here, the Battery Park City Master Plan in New York City, which you see on the left, the Fifth Avenue Terrace for the New York Public Library, which we followed almost immediately with Bryant Park, which you see in the middle. All in those first crazy 5-6 years, just one thing after another. Well, building our office staff with all of us learning on the job, we also began to gain an understanding of the difficulties of producing significant public space in the latter part of the 20th century in the United States. Within the next several years, while these first projects were under construction, we also began work on entire districts and significant public spaces in Europe and America, necessitating further consideration regarding the intersection of purpose, character, elements, and arrangement within particular environments and cultures to shape the public realm. Playa Vista in Los Angeles, Canary Wharf, Bishopsgate, Ludgate, King's Cross in London. The French sociologist Lucien Lefebvre has written, "Each society offers its own particular space. In ancient Greece, there was the polis, consisting of the agora, various public stoas, streets, and ways. After the developments referred to a moment ago in the 19th century, major Western cities incorporated what he refers to as bourgeois space, with their emphasis upon spaces of exchange and commerce. Well, as everybody in this room knows, much of what we think of as public places today in this country are really not civic spaces at all. Much of our environment is really an expression of economic determinism, subject to privilege, exclusion, surveillance, and commercial management." But going on, according to Lefebvre, genuine social space is made up of an ensemble of vital characteristics. First, there is a matter of accommodating social practices, including necessary performance criteria and standards of competence. To be able to promenade down a street without having to concentrate unduly or avoid bumping into other people or falling into open basement areas, for instance. Second, is a matter of having a sufficient representativeness to the space in question by the way of signs and other codes so that it's legible, imaginable, and so on. In short, not to mistake a church for a dry cleaner's, or, for example. And third, he says, social practices require representational spaces embodying complex symbolism about, for example, identity, ownership, or civic pride. And then he says, in civic realist terms, this means creatively making environments for those practices involving the state and civil society in everyday life, which are either widely regarded or warrant distinction. Well, another key criterion for social space that emerges is the tolerance of real variety of social practices within limits that are well defined by both custom and the physical attributes of the place itself. Over the years, as I worked on these urban projects and thought about those that I felt were exemplary and began to watch how the places we'd been making were working, I also realized that Olmsted had got something rather profoundly right, namely our need for contact with the natural phenomena. Considering the increasing urbanization of world culture, questions of human and social well-being, and our relationship to nature and its attributes as a matter of health, well-being, personal and physical development, and social justice, these are topics facing all of those who plan and design public spaces in urban situations. The needs of children and the elderly, for example. Not a central audience for civic design in the past, largely because their needs were accommodated through a looseness in the settlement fabric, as well as family and social structures, unlike most of those today. These are rarely addressed as influential in the design of cities or public space. As the middle class struggles in America and elsewhere today just to maintain the situation enjoyed in the past century, and other cultures attempt to achieve or deny a successful and open middle class and its amenities, questions of resource allocation and content, design character and elements pose questions for those involved in planning and design. Our work from the start has taken a clear position on these issues, through which I have referred to as the conscious perfection of the ordinary. This stems from an interest and a conviction that commonplace and everyday environments, provided they are of sufficient quality, can bring people into contact with the essence of things and thereby provide them with an excitement or deep comfort about the world they inhabit. Moreover, if one's daily routine and spatial experiences can be rendered well in ordinary terms, both the meaningfulness and congeniality of public life will be greatly enhanced. Instead of being banal or mundane, ordinary spatial and sensory experiences can bring us close to the world and in a natural relationship to it. At about the same time that we were developing much of this early work in the office in Philadelphia, I was also teaching up here at Harvard, as Charles mentioned. Well, across the street from the GSD, in Emerson Hall, is the home of the philosophy department. And over there, Hilary Putnam, Stanley Cavell, and Nelson Goodman were debating and working their way through what is referred to as ordinary language problems, in part having to do with nagging doubts about our relationship to the existence of the world, or at least our ability to deal with persistent problems of meaning. I found their work inspiring, in part because of their interest in our capacity to have meaningful, useful exchange and shared lives through the employment of ordinary language. My interest in the ordinary was a decidedly quotidian one. I felt that pursuing it in our work provided a useful basis for deciding things that my colleagues felt to be truly undecidable aspects of expressive meaning. Now, there's a lot of talk today about sustainability, a topic that landscape architects have been concerned with for centuries. A central premise of sustainability is, or it should be, that of sustaining health, both mental and physical, as if they could be separated. Many people, thinkers since classical antiquity, philosophers, artists, social critics, architects, poets, have posited that urban areas and cities are harsh and unhealthy environments, and that natural and rural ones are healthier, even morally superior. They discount, however, that there are serious problems and issues in rural environments as well. One can behave ethically or unethically, morally or immorally in any environment, especially today. I can personally attest to the fact that rural poverty can at times be even more bestial and hopeless than that of urban areas. Certainly for children who often have more options and opportunities in cities than their country cousins. Nevertheless, this recurring feeling about cities is based upon something that has a factual basis. Thoreau, Emerson, and Olmsted all felt the profound attraction of nature and wrote extensively and passionately about the subject, even while attracted to and working within the context of community and rapidly expanding cities. Well, a few years ago, Richard Louv gathered together a worrying and thoughtful amount of information from scientific research, educational studies and reports, clinical data, and thoughtful journalists and government agencies in a remarkable book entitled The Last Child in the Woods, in which he makes a case for what he described as nature deficit disorder. In it, he presents the case that contact with nature is essential for the healthy physical and emotional development of children. He doesn't present it as a cure-all for the wave of obesity, attention deficit disorders, depression, anxiety, and other ills afflicting more and more people, especially the young and developed societies. But the many studies and researchers he surveys make a compelling case for the role that exposure to and familiarity with nature and natural phenomenon plays in the care and feeding of our nervous system and our mental development and acuity. More recently, researchers at Heriot-Watt and Edinburgh University in Scotland have concluded a series of studies to test the ancient assumption that the combination of contact with nature, fresh air, and moderate exercise as a break from urban routine is fundamentally good for people. I mean, we all think that, but many of us have had the ad hoc and personal feeling of well-being or an improved mood after a breath of fresh air, stroll through a park on a lunch break or a weekend. But these academics decided to see what basis, if any, there might be physiologically. Well, as reported in the British Journal of Sports Medicine, they attached portable EEGs, electroencephalograms, if you aren't up on that one, to the scalp of a number of healthy young adults, and they sent them out on predetermined walks through 3 different urban scenes for 1.5 miles. This was in Edinburgh. It included a historic shopping district with handsome architecture, numerous pedestrians and light traffic. Then there was a park-like setting, and finally there was a busy commercial district with contemporary architecture of concrete and glass with very heavy traffic. Well, the result was what one might expect. The recorded brainwave showed mental activity in areas associated with frustration and coping with difficulty while in the busy commercial area, and they were calmer as they moved through the green spaces, and rather than merely exhibiting less signs of stress, the recorded data even showed similar patterns to the mental activities such as those subjects involved in meditation or quiet concentration. As one researcher remarked about the mental activity observed in the more natural setting, it's called involuntary attention in psychology. It holds our attention while at the same time allowing scope for reflection. Well, in other words, a brief stroll through a park area is more than a mere palliative against urban stress, but also a situation that allows for and encourages mental acuity and activity of a productive or creative kind. By the way, all the images I've been showing since we left the paintings have been from various projects of ours, and I just didn't want to name them all. That would be drab. Now, these women here are walking on the roof of a conference center in Salt Lake City that we did with our friends ZGF from Portland. It's a version of what Alexander Pope referred to as calling the country in. And as suggested earlier, designers, poets, and potentates before Olmsted on numerous occasions proposed the importation of natural landscapes into cities, literally roofs in urbs, creating parks that attempted to reproduce aspects of natural scenery in parks, gardens, and estates. Many of these were developed in conjunction with natural features such as streams, rivers, escarpments, sites that pose difficulty or hazard for development, and opportunity for gardens, villas, parks, and recreation. As a result, many historic urban areas have a legacy of great parks that were well loved and heavily used. Unfortunately, as most cities around the world and their economic problems have grown in recent decades, many societies have been unable or unwilling to continue such practices at a scale commensurate with the needs of their population for such beneficial domains, or at least not at the scale of the need. But even on a smaller scale, there are a lot of things one can do. Let's look at Columbus Circle in New York. One aspect of many civic spaces from the past that I've studied and grown fond of, whether in Europe, America, or Asia, is a spirit of generosity, of largesse, a surplus of some kind, whether it be of space, materials, scale, furnishings, or delight in some form. Columbus Circle was a space that had been through much iteration before its devolution in the 1980s into a bewildering and dysfunctional intersection. As you see in that top drawing, that's what it used to be. Bob Hanna and I were asked by the Central Park Conservancy to see if we could fix it, and we did this scheme that you see in the lower image, but we were dismissed by Henry Stern, the Parks Commissioner, when we tried to straighten out the awkward entry to Central Park that was created by Robert Moses. That was a complete mess, while removing a number of weed trees that had obscured Olmsted's spatial composition. If you proposed cutting a tree when Henry Stern was commissioner, you were fired. It was just, didn't matter, you know. Others later executed some aspects of this proposal adjacent to the park around the main memorial that you see there. Well, my office worked on it again in the mid-90s for a second time as part of an ideas competition sponsored by the Municipal Arts Association, but again, without any result. We did this with Machado Silvetti, friends of ours from Boston and the GSD. That time we were interested in the potential of revealing the layers of subway concourses beneath it, the possibility of connecting the spaces visually with skylights, fountains, and seating that would create a public theater of sorts around this monument to the ancient mariner. I thought it could be this kind of Piranesi-like thing you could do. But when it finally became a viable project in the late autumn after 9/11, in the waning days of the Giuliani administration, the MTA forbid us from opening up their concourse, and the Streets Department prevented us from unifying the entire circus, Center Island roadways, and surrounding walks with unit pavers of any kind, let alone stone. Good heavens. Nevertheless, as they say, I was determined to create more than a mere refuge from traffic, and pushed for an open, attractive place into which one could step out of the city even while still in it, to look around, relax, meet friends, or merely just use as a shortcut across the intersection. And this we have done through the employment of several devices. First, and most important, the traffic was reorganized by Philippe Habib, the brilliant transportation planner and civil engineer, with 3 very carefully placed signals and pedestrian crossings. Next, we manipulated the topography, creating a step berm planted on the outside and with fountains on the inside and broad walkways that sliced through the berm. We also inverted what had existed before. The Columbus Monument had stood in a basin, a miserable little puddle, which even in its peculiarly small size kept people away from the monument. The entire ensemble was wide open to the streets and traffic that swirled around. So instead, we created a true island surrounded by water and large and generous fountains that masked the noise of the traffic in the city while providing movement, light, and cooling on hot summer days. I also liked that it was an island. After all, Columbus discovered a group of islands, not a continent. So conventional wisdom also has it that seating, especially park benches, should always have backs to lean against comfortably. Well, here I concluded there was no correct direction to sit facing, and that the vertical presence of bench backs would chop up the relatively small space and cut off the fountains from the center and across the space visually. So we made enormous, long, curving benches with a cross-section of a wide wooden pillow. As a result, people came at all hours of day and night to sit or stretch out in all directions, in all groups, couples, singly, as well as on the rescued steps of the base of the historic monument in the middle. It has become truly a new place to be in the city that never existed before. And it's in the middle of a 5-way intersection. In fact, people also do use it to traverse the intersection, something unheard of before. So, returning to the remark of a few minutes ago, this is a space that provides a generosity and an amplitude of materials, of sensual experience, of scale and spirit with its fountains, the circle of buckeye trees and planting, the graceful stone and the fulsome benches. Well, you can well imagine my pleasure when less than a year after it was completed, the New Yorker magazine used a drawing of it as seen from the windows of Lincoln Center Jazz in the adjacent Time Warner building as a graphic image of the city for one of their festivals. It had already become a recognizable and memorable part of what was their own self-image. It's now on the mental map of New Yorkers as a place, and as a pleasurable one at that. So this principle of making places particular and not generic is as important as it is making them well. On one of my first projects back in 1977, when in a public meeting in Denver, I was asked by the head of the Regional Transportation District, why was I proposing a polychrome granite paved street with trees? I responded that it was a better deal than building such an important street at the heart of the city out of concrete or asphalt. I suggested that it was the single most important public space in the heart of the polis, and they couldn't afford to build it cheaply or badly. In my view, it was a place where the citizens could come and be together, to see and interact with each other and the commercial core of the metropolitan region, and that it needed to be special. I pointed out the relatively short and shorter life of concrete and asphalt roadways in the Denver region due to the remarkable freeze-thaw cycles, and that a stone, especially granite, a material produced under intense heat and pressure, was one of the most durable materials on the planet, and that we didn't know how long it would last before needing to be replaced, since most of the Appian Way was still in place, except for a portion that had been stolen by the mafia for resale as a durable building material. How could Denver not afford to build seriously in their most public space? Well, the scheme our office developed with Harry Cobb, IMP's partner, was conceptually very simple. It consisted of a pavement conceived as a carpet runner, albeit 12 blocks long, 2 rows of trees and lights that were more like floor lamps than street lights, that shone down on the pavement and up on the trees. He and I both loved James Thurber's drawings of big chairs, dogs, big women, and these floor lamps. And so we said, floor lamps, that's what we need. The carpet pattern was largely inspired by several 19th century Navajo trading blankets, although I will admit, I did notice some rattleskin snake belts in a tourist shop on the street when I was doing my initial site reconnaissance, and the ghost of the pavement in the Pantheon in Rome hovered somewhere in the back of both of our minds. Well, here is 16th Street before and after our project. There are actually a few benches and small fountains at the beginning and end of the central portion for punctuation, but I didn't want to do much else, so as to allow the community to figure out how much else they wanted and how they were going to use it. Well, our details weren't perfect, and like most design professionals, as I said earlier, we were learning on the job. It's held up pretty well. But our work has always been an experiment. Clients hate it. They don't want to know that it's a full-size mock-up, that it's a real-time experiment, their project, But it is. Anyway, there have been some necessary repairs and some maintenance. However, the net effect has been overwhelmingly positive. Recent efforts by Downtown Denver Incorporated, a business organization in the Regional Transportation District, to make changes that they asked ZGF and our office to help them with. We made some proposals, and we ran into absolutely strong opposition from the citizens, who have declared it to be a well-loved historic landmark. When I told a public meeting, I was in this public meeting, and I said that I was the original designer and that several improvements would be appropriate, I was told, forget it. The mall was theirs, and they didn't want anybody messing with it. So I found that kind of prideful and humiliating both. Well, these two pictures were taken 30 years apart. This public scheme, the upper one is the older one, if you can't tell, but anyway. This public scheme has helped to generate hundreds of millions of dollars in investment, construction, and is the most popular and visited site in the city. Our notion that a well-built and handsome street of granite with trees, something of a ramblas or stretched piazza, might work as a sociable space even in contemporary America, that it might work, has proved successful. The degree to which it became attractive to the homeless people and young teens for a while, who had nowhere else to go for a time, didn't mean there was something wrong with it, only there was something wrong with the surroundings and the management and the society in general. I'm happy to say that today this space is managed well, and the ordinary middle class, office workers, shoppers, visitors, as well as disadvantaged and homeless people and teenagers are all happily accommodated there. It is truly a civic space. It's open, it's democratic, it's generous, and it's life-affirming. Well, we began that project clear back in 1977, as you heard, which is like a long time ago. And years later, fast forward up to the 21st century, in 2001, I joined a group of other professionals in the city of Portland, Oregon, to study an urban situation that they'd puzzled about for several generations. And that was what to do in an area facing redevelopment between two distinctly different but important and well-loved sequences of parks. the South Park blocks and the North Park blocks, and there was this area that had no parks and was just buildings due to a political screw-up back in the 1920s. So while planning what to do there with this group of friends, whoops, too far, no, stop here. While planning for several of the spaces that we proposed to put into that missing tooth there, the missing gap, the first one that was to be implemented was to be on top of a below-grade multi-story parking garage that was already in construction. So I proposed to my colleagues, Carol Meyer-Reed, a landscape architect I'm fond of in Portland, and to ZGF, an architecture firm we know and have worked with, that we create a small urban piazza, partly in contrast to all the other public spaces in the city and region, and partly because it seemed to offer something that I believed would be popular and well used in that particular location, climate, and city. So this is what a lot of our sites start out looking like. There's no land there, you know. So there's a plan above and a longitudinal section below. So despite all of this, anyway, this led to discussions about what should constitute a park today. And I thought, I don't even want to talk about it. So despite all my earlier remarks about my deep interest in the topic, I didn't want to debate about it with the gang out there while we were getting started on this, because most of the debate centered around lawn, around naturalism, and the appropriateness of whether we should have a cafe or not. And I thought, oh, get over it. Of course we'll have a cafe. So I'm neither a formula nor a rules kind of guy, as some of you must know. I simply felt that it would be nice to create a lovely place that looked good even when it was damp on a gray, drizzly day, and where one could sit and socialize, read a paper, you know, have a cup of coffee. They sure drink a lot of coffee out there, or a snack. Meet a friend, watch people, and simply relax in public. So I was interested in comfort and making it welcoming. This meant that it needed to be open, and it needed to have a variety of comfortable, attractive, and generous seating. I also knew that there are few truly special public squares and parks I really like that don't have water and trees. So Director Park ended up with just that mix of things. I began with some sketches before we had a plan, and really we were trying to invent the program. And in this return to the Pacific Northwest, my interest in its damp atmosphere and fascination for constructed, or what you might think of as lithic stone surfaces, to some extent drove the scheme. Why, I wondered, didn't people in the rainy Northwest cover public squares with glass like the great train sheds and arcades in Europe in the 19th century? I'd spent many hours outdoors in winter on a porch when I lived on Bainbridge Island in Puget Sound. You know, a veranda. I lived, worked, ate, drew, everything out on this veranda. One could do all that stuff. You draw, paint, be with friends, out of doors most of the year in the Pacific Northwest if you are undercover. Also, as every landscape architect knows, water runs downhill. The site, which was a tiny one, it was only 30 by 60 meters, sloped considerably from north to south, almost a full story. So I proposed a couple of level terraces with a high canopy of glass at a civic scale, which was another big argument. Why is it so tall? You know, shouldn't it be lower? You know, be more intimate. I said, no, it wants to be civic. We had this debate. Oh, God. Anyway, so then I said it should have a small cafe, loose tables and chairs, a fountain at the bottom end, at the low end of the site where the sun was, to gather and hold the water that was sprayed up spray some water up in the air and let it run down the pavement and catch it, and it'd be a basin, and then rainfall, ditto. Well, there are also benches and various furnishings, such as on the chessboard on the tables and the pavement here, there's a chessboard there, but all around it there's solid benches and tables and chairs and a small space under these trees. And like many of our projects, the whole thing, as I just said, was built over 5 levels of parking garage. So there are also sizable vent and stair structures we had to accommodate that were already planned before we were I got to move one of them, that was it, and help shape them. But despite the concern of others that it needed to be softer with more planting, I argued that Portland was dripping with vegetation, that its citizens lived in the most verdant region in the U.S., and that wasn't what they needed more of in this particular space. I also argued for a cafe, as I said, with toilets, convinced it was wrong-headed to build public places without these fundamental amenities, and that one could not depend upon the neighboring businesses that are subject to the vagaries of economic cycles and would not want non-customers using their facilities, especially those who are on hard times or mothers who just want to change the diapers for their babies. So while arguing for a fountain of some sort, I concluded that it needed to be rather modest, even a silly one, maybe, not so grand. This was because just across town is one of the great works of the 20th century landscape design, Ira's Fountain by Larry Halpern. Now, Larry was one of my heroes, and this particular work was enormous inspiration to me when I was entering the field. So I remember saying to my friends in Portland that with Beethoven down the street, one doesn't do Beethoven. You do something else, something with a lighter touch. So I thought of the space as analogous to a small salon in the great palace of the city. It was one for chamber music or intimate gatherings, not grand balls and concerts. So this is a small study model that I had Tiffany Beamer, who has since become our partner in Los Angeles, make this little model for me to help us play with it and figure out and how to talk with our fountain consultant, who was very helpful and got it immediately from looking at this thing. Well, as with the several other projects of mine, the surface was conceived of as a fabric of stone. And while it began with the memory of woven baskets, in this case several by Native Americans who once lived in the Columbia River Basin, it's monochromatic. And in this case, I wanted the pavement to be quiet, to be calm and elegant, with visual interest and richness that came from texture and pattern, not from color. And I began exploring various herringbone patterns and block sizes, shapes and textures, as you see from this sketches from my sketchbook. Well, the beautiful blonde granite that we found, reminiscent of the pale grasses, the straw, and the roots of these other native structures, is cut into long, thin blocks. And mostly they're bush-hammered, but there's a series of lines that run diagonally through the pavement that are made from blocks that are reeded. That is, they're tooled with a corrugation. Water, light, dirt enhance these textures. Some days, and from some directions, it is sharp and noticeable. And in others, and under different conditions, it's more subtle and barely noticeable at all. The stair treads that feather out into the slope are handsomely tooled and modular with the pavers. And as often happens on our projects, the workmen became intrigued and got into what they were making, and they did a beautiful job. They really loved working on this project.